Valerie and Lavina and Cheryl's over there. I got to make her a mod, their co-host. There you go. And Pat and BB and others over there. Good to see you. And so here we go with tradition requires that I ring the air horn to cover the big stories. And the first big story is that Apple has decided to pause all sales in Russia. And Apple's also removing the Russian media outlets, RT and Sputnik, from the App Store. Apparently they have apps, and they're removing them from the App Store globally, basically, or actually anywhere outside of Russia, basically. And also disabling Apple Maps live traffic in Ukraine, which we, being the uber geeks that we are, we know that they are basically copying Google on that front, because we read that same headline from Google 48 hours ago, where Google Maps has live traffic views, and Google Maps has a very cool feature to let you see how busy a particular location is, because it's tracking cell phone, data usage and whatnot. And they turned that off for reasons you can probably imagine if you have more than 5 brain cells. So good to see Apple following Android on that one, but kudos to Android for doing it first, in all fairness. But kudos to both.
Tyler, I have a really, really twisted idea. Imagine if Apple and Android would publish a news app on all Russian mobile phones across everything, which give them a view from the outside. You can't ask 200 million people to turn off their mobiles.
No, Russia would softly demand that Apple and Google stop doing that, of course. But you're right. That would
What will they do?
Right. You can't really stop them. That's a great book. Actually,
Yeah.
no. Apple, Russia can. In fact, we know
They
this
do.
because Russia slowed down Twitter as a punishment for Twitter. So the thought is, and you'll remember as well, Johan, now that I bring this up, one of the Twitter obviously shares stuff that many countries would prefer they don't. India as well is constantly asking Twitter to take down stuff that's negative towards the government. So does Thailand, by the way. So does Russia. So does China. Or not China, it's not in China. But Russia does too. And Twitter was not complying particularly with Russia. This was 9 months ago. And Twitter said, you either take that content down that we've asked you to take down, or we will slow down your service in Russia, which they did. And then it was found out. We read one article. I really should have saved it, because it was the technical blueprint for precisely how they've done it, where they've gone in and put little boxes between somewhere in the link, and across every company, that they injected a kind of government gateway that controls this. And I remember that article, and hardcore tech newsers probably do too, but it was fleeting. And I remember saying, holy shit, that's wild. They have control of the internet. So they can slow down any third part and any app or site. They can control the speed and the bandwidth, and they can slow it to be uncomfortably unusable. So if an Apple app that they don't like, they could slow it down so that it's basically unusable, essentially. But your point is really interesting, that there is conceivably a way that American apps or media could try to inject narratives in ways that, of course, Russia is very sensitive to controlling. Obviously, this is one of the big issues in this I was going to say in this conflict, and some people take offense to calling it a conflict. But call it whatever you want. I'm not going to. We'll save that argument for another time. But the point is that a lot of what's going on that is sort of somewhat unique to this, whatever you call it, is the digital information, misinformation, disinformation, narrative crafting. You get the idea. And of course, that's as old as dirt. But it used to be done by dropping leaflets from airplanes. And that was an incredibly well-tested concept, when post the post airplanes until the internet, where when one side wants to send a message to the other side, they drop leaflets from airplanes saying, you should surrender because we have you surrounded, blah, 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 blah. Well, we're now looking at the social media 3.0 versions of this, where the disinformation campaigns and sock puppet and astroturfing and bots and holy shit, it's a really wild AI driven modern version of those airplane leaflets, isn't it? So, and we're at the cutting edge of that. We're witnessing some truly unprecedented cleverness in that regard from every side. But what yesterday, the real interesting takeaway on this point was that all the big tech platforms, namely TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and there was another, YouTube, are all complying to do their damnedest to limit all of the state-run media outlets out of Russia from being heard anywhere outside of Russia. And they seem to have a handle on it. They seem to be doing that. And Russia saying, hey, turn our YouTube accounts back on outside of Russia. We've got shit we want people to hear. And YouTube and TikTok and everybody saying, yeah, the EU has said not to turn you on. So we're just complying in the EU with what they've told us to do. So no one in the EU is going to hear your narratives, which now it's almost like stopping those airplane leaflets midair. It's a really interesting development in kind of information warfare, so to speak. So the top story today, again, to reiterate, is that Apple's pausing all sales of all Apple products in Russia. They're removing RT and Sputnik News from the app stores outside of Russia. Very similar move to what TikTok and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram or whatever are doing. And they've also disabled Apple Maps live traffic data in Ukraine. So ostensibly, let me connect the dots for you, so that the Russians can't see where the Ukrainians are in Ukraine. So the next related article is that Google will also remove RT and Sputnik apps from the Play Store. Wow, simultaneously, same day. After removing Russian state outlets from its news features, meaning Google News, they're now removing their actual apps, just as Apple is. The fact that that is happening on the same day on both platforms tells you that somebody told them to do it. It's not a coincidence that they're both doing it on the same day, practically in the same 12-hour window. It means somebody's calling the shots and telling both of those platforms, remove these apps now. And they're complying. Interesting move. That is, if you think about that for a minute, the power of a government, be it the EU or the US or whoever, to tell both platforms, Google and Apple, remove that app now, and they comply. I'm not aware of previous examples of that. I'm sure there are.
Parlor.
Parler still exists.
Yeah, but
And
they were removed from the app stores simultaneously.
Yeah.
and
So
by the way, I just sent another link to Cheryl. Tyler, you're gonna like it. It's related to this. It has an entire list of all the tech companies. It's a recent, within last few hours or day or something. It has an entire list. I mean, of all the tech companies and what's going on there. Cheryl has that in her inbox as well.
And
so
Tyler, Reuters just have some news that says the Russian instant Twitter slowdown. So just like you said, they just make the speed for the features. And they said Meta, Google are also maybe undergo this
what
slowdown
yes,
treatment.
what
Yeah.
BB's saying is that Reuters has a story that Russia is reinstating their Twitter traffic slowdown. It's back in action right now, 9 months later, right now today, because they're claiming that Twitter's not removing content that they don't like. And they don't want people to see that content. And because it's exactly as Johan's saying, which is it's content that's telling them potentially narratives that are counter to the official narrative. So Google are instigators of war is one of the statements from Russia today as well. Carl, you got your hand up. What's up? Oh, sorry. I need to check the audio over in Twitter stage line. Carl, can you please count to 10?
Yep. 1, 2, 3, 4. 7, 8, 9, 10. Getting a bit of audio feedback. I can hear myself a little bit, and now it's gone. Are we good?
Yep.
I was just going to say, as a counterpoint, is it not possible also that C-level executives from both companies just basically had a call and discussion and said, hey, what should we do, as opposed to being forced?
No, not likely. So,
what makes that not likely? I'm sorry to push the point. What makes that not likely?
They don't. That's not. That would be an unprecedented move, with the exception of when they got together to allow sharing of API data to do COVID contact tracing. That was
which was an unprecedented situation.
Correct.
Which caused them to make an unprecedented decision.
Correct.
Is this not the same?
No.
I'm only asking because the narrative is very different there. One is obviously a government state enforcing something, and the other one is an almost altruistic decision between corporate entities. It's a different narrative.
I know. However, in fuller context, 24 hours ago, lots of the big social media apps and Google News removed Russian state media. Today, Apple and Google remove those state media apps from their app stores. That's happening in the EU and the US rather simultaneously. And we know that it was driven by the EU in the case of the EU with the social media apps in the EU, because the EU said we now have the resources to force the social media apps to ban these narratives. And then the apps are saying we're complying with the EU and we're removing this at the behest of the EU. That was all done transparently. It's not being done quite as transparently in the US, but it's happening simultaneously. So it's sort of it's not a far leap to assume that what's happening in the US is just mirroring what's happening in the EU.
That's fair. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying.
Hey, Tyler, this Ken. I would make the point, and it's not an exact thing, but I'm sure that they probably used it as a stretch, that in the United States we have something called the Defense Production Act. We also have specific laws allowing the president to basically commandeer airlines in the times of national crisis. He's probably stretching some of these laws, suggesting that we're at war, even though we're not legally at war on a technical basis because Congress hasn't declared one. But that didn't stop us from Vietnam and Korea. And he's probably going to say that, based on those acts and the intent of those acts, the national government has broad powers to command private industry to do certain things. And I'm sure that they're looking at something like that.
And if you look at the link that's posted up top, you'll see like this long list of all these American companies. And I mean, they all have lobbyists, right? And if they're all getting hit and restricted and nationalized stuff and stopped, I mean, that's a direct kind of attack on many American companies. If you check out that list.
Just thinking this through quickly, obviously, Tyler, if you're correct, that also changes the timeline of when they can potentially reverse this situation. I mean, it's unlikely to be the case forever. If it was a decision made off their own backs, obviously, then that consideration to reverse it, the Russian people, is down to the C-level executives. But if it's state ordered, I mean, they don't really have the ability then to revoke it.
That's the hot question of the moment, because as is my tendency to do so, to think about the nth degree of any scenario. The nth degree of this scenario is particularly interesting because as I said 48 hours ago when we met, I did this thought exercise about what is the nth degree scenario for governments controlling data and apps, and I realized something that I was quite surprising to even myself, which was, I think the strongest move in the cyber warfare landscape would be for a government to tell its tech companies to turn off everything, all transmissions of data in around in another geography. And in this case, what I'm referring to, of course, is the US would tell Google, which owns Android, Apple, which owns the iPhones, and Microsoft, which has Windows, to turn off all data transmissions to and from all of their devices, which would render all smartphones and laptops into paperweights instantaneously, which I believe would cause mass chaos within a matter of 30 minutes. So I have to assume that's I kind of double checked that it is feasible technologically, and that issue of would tech companies comply? Well, that's why this conversation that we're having is so interesting, is because we're watching the tech companies comply rather expeditiously. So, although I really feel like that's the nuclear option of turning off all devices, laptops and smartphones, we might actually see this happen. I have a hard time even imagining what happens when an entire nation's smartphones and laptops all become paperweights simultaneously, Carl.
I did
I was just
actually
thinking the
discuss
other. Oh
this
no, go ahead.
yesterday.
Tyler, quick thing on that one. So one thing I've been watching, from the security space, from the software space, stuff like that. Some of the biggest problems companies are having right now are they have tons of developers in both Ukraine and Russia. That's one scenario. So if they were to pull that nuclear option, that would cut off all access. Right now, the biggest problem that they have is they can't pay those people. Right? So paid because most of the Ukrainians can't access their banks. The Russians just pretty much cut off that supply chain because of all of this stuff. So those are things I haven't seen brought up, and there are a ton of developers out there. I could tell you, I know of a lot of mobile apps that are built out in the Eastern Bloc too.
Mm.
And if you, by the way, a fascinating map is the live cyber warfare that is under like what's going on within the last. They're down to within the last hour from a very credible company. You could see all of the attack. It looks nuts, man. And I posted it over to Tech News Around the World on the Twitter.
Yeah, just
There
to
are
recall. Sorry, go ahead.
there are about 350,000 Ukrainian developers that work for EU and American companies, and that's a very large outsourcing issue because we are in some ways dependent on those developers. I don't have the information for Russian, but I did get the Ukrainian from the BBC this morning.
On each of these theaters, the military, the economic, and the I was going to throw a biscuit to your doggy. Here you go. But they're
He's
just going to be
craving
the.
that biscuit for sure.
It's my point is escalation. And so in cyber, there's going to be different levels of escalation. That there is going to be a nuclear at DEF CON whatever, right? But we're going to be very thoughtful with regards to how that's escalated.
Okay, so there's who is that? Frank, who's on the Twitter Spaces stage, just shared a DM saying that Twitter is no longer translating Russian to English, and but is doing Ukrainian. Tweets of some Russians can't be live translated into tweets, and there's a horde of similar types things. Facebook, this is the next big headline, by the way. According to protocol, Facebook will demote all content which is leaking to Russian state media outlets on Facebook and Instagram globally, and rolls out encrypted Instagram DMs in Ukraine and in Russia. And if that's not fodder for the kind of gravity of the use case of encryption, I don't know what is. And I said that is going to be one of the big issues facing governments and people, similar to Bitcoin, when the governments are figuring out this issue about encryption and they're already making their moves, but the rest of the world's kind of just waking up to all of it. And
Tyler,
yes,
one quick thing on that. So turning off Russian translation from Russian to English drastically impacts the threat intelligence world because a lot of people, incident response, threat intelligence, they drastically rely on a lot of that for, when they get communications, just to get a baseline understanding of what's being said. And a lot of that was done just with the Conti leaks, believe it or not, because, finding a Russian linguist, is interesting times because a lot of them are in fear. They're going to get attacked the same way, the Asians did during COVID. So it's causing lots of interesting scenarios out there right now.
That
Or
kind of
the
goes back to.
translators.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, really, go ahead.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the translators in the Middle East who would get attacked by the Taliban and other forces because they were helping the U.S. So there's also that kind of um, potential for their harm. So just because they're helping us, they themselves become a target, which is unfortunate.
I was just
And
going to say,
Tom, real quick, hey Tom, I sent you
my,
the link you requested on that the live map. Maybe you know, and they got the ports in there too, and what the specific attacks are. I don't know if you could maybe speak to that.
It gives me nightmares of the days of Norse. Those are those people that remember Norse because it looks exactly like that. So the first question people are going to go, is this live data or is this people just, fantasizing the days of war games and that being WAP or pretending to be World War? I mean, that's the interesting part of those things. So thank you for sending that. And I was curious if it was like the same thing from Norse back in the days.
I want to
Tyler,
hold on. Yes, Cheryl.
I want to ask why does Google want to stop the translation from Russian to English? Because communication is important, right?
I
I
don't know.
mean, I'm sure a majority of the Russians do not like what's happening now too.
Okay.
So we
Nobody.
shouldn't.
Maybe for the
Nobody.
disinformation.
Nobody knows the answer to that question, Cheryl. So I'll save you.
I just think it's sad because we cannot penalize the whole Russian because of what the leaders do, right?
Okay. So I want to we are in Twitter Spaces. We have our friend Cal Patel. We have a whole lot more people, Frank and Jason and Valerie and Piotr's back and Carl's back, and they both have their hands up. Carl is notoriously very brief with his comments, so I'm going to let Carl go first, and then Piotr's notoriously can be a bit long-winded in a great way, but we're going to enjoy that when we get to it. But Carl, you go first. Hold on, what happened, Carl? We don't hear you.
I was happy to defer to Piotr, but just quickly, I know the response is probably going to be that the US administration already does this, but hello, nothing?
We're here. We hear
Anything?
you. Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, what about now? Is it in time or
yes,
a
we
massive
can
delay?
hear you.
We have no problem hearing you whatsoever.
Okay, I apologize.
here.
I apologize. I was just going to say, I'm sure the response would be that the American administration is already doing this, but let's just pretend for a moment that they're not. They don't already have agreements with all
And now we
these
don't.
companies to
Now we don't hear you.
transfer.
It's almost like you knew
You're cutting out.
It's almost like he knew he was going to get cut off. That's okay. We'll come back to you, Carl. Piotr, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tyler. I won't be too long. I'm sure most people have either been in our room or been following it in depthly on some of the Twitter spaces here, and you guys are discussing it obviously in depth. I heard the mention of nuclear conflict. That's not anywhere near likely to be the case. If it was, then Putin would have already started, moving it beyond the special alert phase, which he announced on Monday. But he hasn't. So it's very much a symbolic gesture as a way to try and emphasize to NATO that that's how Russia feels by putting the nukes on sort of more able to, well, the first phase and what it would take to actually get them ready for sort of deployment. But he hasn't. So it is a distractive tactic. And whilst the Belarusians had their sort of referendum on Sunday to allow more nuclear warheads to be installed in their land or territory, again, it's just because you put nukes there doesn't mean you're actually going to use them. So I want to urge people caution on that, and I think that was consolidated by Biden's address during the State of the Union yesterday. I think that on that, I'm not going into the domestic politics or what you think of Biden, but in terms of just as a leader trying to retain Western unity, I think Biden is doing a pretty decent job. Given the circumstances, I can't think of many leaders who would be able to do much better, to be honest with you. Main thing at the moment is, the updates are quite slow on our end. This big convoy that was seen going towards Kiev from the north has got stuck. Lots of miscommunications, issues with supply lines, and generally a sort of an increasing questionative sort of feeling amongst junior ranking soldiers. And I'll touch upon that a little bit more in a second. But yeah, generally that big convoy hasn't sort of reached Kiev yet. But what we are seeing is that the Russians are proposing a second round of negotiations. The Ukrainians are yet to reply, as far as I'm aware. And as this continues to go, the Russians are increasingly using, methods that breach the law of armed conflict. So they're using cluster bombs, which essentially release small versions of what are called bomblets, which are basically just explosive bits of shrapnel and are not meant to kill, but induce as much pain as possible. Then there are thermobaric bombs, as they're called. Thermobaric bombs are like essentially you have two explosive devices. One detonates, it releases a cloud of sort of flammable gas, which can infiltrate non-airtight areas. And then a second charge explodes and it basically creates a huge bloody fireball, which eradicates anything in its pathway, including even if it is a door or a building or something, because the gas has gone there through there, the fire, the detonation can carry through. So they're very, very destructive, and, completely against, sort of international humanitarian law, or IHL. So this is what I'm concerned by, is that Russia begins to up the ante through these, methods to try and force the hand of the Ukrainians. We're seeing the sanctions really, really take effect. You guys are talking, very much about the tech side of that. And it's, if this continues to go on, the Russians will just simply not have the capacity to continue this campaign, just because they'll have to put every single resource towards it, as the Russian economy essentially is squeezed and becomes like it was in the 90s, or even like sort of a North Korean styled economy. That's going to absolutely, prevent it from being able to really fund the resources, or fund this campaign. So Putin, I think, is going to be having as reservations about this. We're seeing about 7,000 or 8,000 Russians have been arrested through protests, and the military police, the police generally are clamping down on Russian sort of backlash as well. So there's a lot going on the domestic side as well. And then just on the military sort of front, I shared something on my Twitter feed yesterday about there was a really interesting Twitter thread about the available information, and the fact that the Russians are just communicating without digital mode. I think it's referred to as, but basically we can read everything they're saying. We can understand exactly what they're doing, and the absolute lack of chain of command that exists within the Russian military. You've got youngsters completely disinformed or misinformed on why they're fighting, what they're supposed to be doing. Central command doesn't really seem to give a shit, and is just sending the boys out there to sort of carry on the work and sort of just. It's Russia's classic tactic of just throw as many forces at the problem as possible, even if it means in numerous casualties. I think 6,000 Russian forces have died at this point, more or less, versus only a few hundred for the Ukrainians, including civilians. So the Russians are definitely not winning this war. The Ukrainians are digging in. It's costing a lot. Kharkiv seems to be the main area of aggression, but there are lots of different fronts, particularly in the east, and Belarusian forces are supposed to have joined in the past day or so. And then obviously there is the Ukrainian ascension process to the EU. That is being fast tracked, but it's not going to happen overnight, because you have to get the country ready to join the EU. And there are many countries like Germany and France particularly, which, as net contributors, would have to up even more to support Ukraine, which would be quite a big bit poorer, unfortunately, than the rest of the other member states. So just because they're beginning the process doesn't mean it's actually happening. And it's the same with NATO. So I hope that peace negotiations can yield something. I really don't know. And I also just saw in the past 10, 15 minutes or so that the Russians apparently have Yanukovych in Minsk. Apparently he is there. And they want to try and reinstall him as the sort of, puppet government, and president of Ukraine. And then they're preparing some kind of operation to replace Zelensky. But, I highly doubt that is going to happen immediately. And also it's not exactly something the West are going to be content with, let alone the Ukrainian people. So, there's a lot going on in the background. And as I say, we're entering this sort of phase now where there's a bit of a lull. We had the initial hurrah around the Russians as they really, went in there heavy across multiple fronts. And now we're seeing less updates. There are obviously bombings and attacks happening, but I think the Russians are beginning to sort of maybe reorientate themselves, recalibrate, and this is the point, I think, in the next couple of days. I think this conflict either begins to wind down quite quickly as the Russians either focus on the negotiations and sort of areas they can maybe get concessions, or they settle in for the long haul, which could be several weeks or months. But I just don't think that they have the resources and capacity to do that. So that's a whirlwind of details. I hope that was relevant and useful.
Okay, thank you. Carl, did you want to try again? And by the way, just in case, because Piotr didn't really push it hard, but he's doing kind of the main instigator of one of the largest ongoing rooms. It's been going for over 5 days and 9 hours, which is fantastic.
I think it's on 7 days already, Tyler. Right, Piotr?
Oh, it shows the length of time. Like this room has been open 45 minutes. In Club Deck, I can see precisely the number of minutes. It's 5 days, 9 hours, and 39 minutes so far, according to Club Deck. It could be longer, of course. But in any case, you're approaching a week, which is just fantastic, by the way. So kudos to Piotr on keeping, and he's generally had 1,000 people in there concurrently throughout most of that, and at times double that. So fantastic show and very valuable example of how this format of social audio can really be incredibly useful. And I think that will only become more so because those of us who remember the early days of Twitter used to argue with our friends about the utility of Twitter. I got in very incredibly heated arguments, and people thought Twitter is a waste of time. I have no interest in what people are eating or when they're doing laundry. And we now realize how valuable Twitter is because we all now know that's where you can go to find out what's going on in short text snippet form. Social audio, similarly, is going to evolve. People are starting to realize that's where you're going to want to go when you want to listen to rooms of people. And that experience, I think, is going to mature and only get better in these types of contexts. And I think Piotr is a great demonstration of exactly that. So that's why I applaud you. Yeah.
Hey Tyler,
I think it's
can I just
running it now
mention a
for
few
that length of
points?
time. It's a weird experience trying to keep it all together. And as it goes on, you get issues happening, team members sort of inadvertently sort of clashing against one another. But the other thing is, I'm just thinking about it. Apparently, the usage of Clubhouse has actually gone up a bit because of the room running, and it sort of reinstalled some interest in it. But my thing is, if this social audio experience is sort of going to be about covering big issues like this in real time, is it a long term viability? I'm just not sure if that sort of it's going to be because you do bring a lot of people together, sure, but it's not exactly that is an easy way to sort of construct. Like I'm having to construct my day around managing the room,
right?
So I'm still wondering whether or not social audio is going to, if this is the best usage of social audio.
Yeah, but what my point is that in the early days of Twitter, the audience was rather limited, and then eventually celebrities of all stripes came on. I think social audio will be similar in that in a future version of this event, the ministers of Ukraine will be utilizing it for the power that it ultimately will have, and in the same as they're using Twitter currently, by the way. And that when they are able to do that, and there's rooms of hundreds of thousands willing to listen to the leadership of Ukraine break shit down in real time, boy, oh boy, you think Twitter has disrupted media. Wait until the social audio version of the format matures and political leaders are using social audio rooms of hundreds of thousands or even millions of people would tune in. And by the way, he could right now. Zelensky tweets from Twitter on Twitter. He could make a Twitter space, for example. You better believe that would break the fucking internet if he did that right now. So I'm kind of curious why he hasn't done that at this point, because he could speak very directly in ways that would be very powerful.
It's only a question of time, Tyler,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's going to be a question of time. Yesterday, I saw, whilst we're really appreciative of the clubhouse rooms and the kind of go-to rooms that Piotr and a couple of other people have created around Ukraine, there's this massive room where one of the top content creators on Twitter around geopolitical issues, as well as, Piotr, there are others. George Lemire, for example, who runs the Red Line Club, one of the original clubs from a year ago. And he was on this room on Twitter, which has also been going on for 5-6 days. There had about 3,000 people in it. Had people on the ground real time on the ground people in the same way as this other rooms. So social audio seems to have found a use case around these crisis things. But to your point, Tyler, I see the politicians jumping on now. Right, they're going to come on direct, and this platform's not going to be taking on like 20 million, 2 million people, right, over a period of time, or 200,000 people. But you're going to find that Twitter Spaces can handle that, right? Technically,
right. That's right. They designed it specifically because of that. And by the way, Twitter Spaces made a very difficult technical decision to sacrifice low latency and immediacy, which we depend on here in the Clubhouse room. Twitter is less snappy, and but they intentionally made that decision to sacrifice that for unlimited room size, so that you can have the scenario that I'm describing, which is, you could have world leaders and Elon Musk and Taylor Swift and whatever, with millions of people in the room, because there's an 8-second delay to the listening audience, so you can have an unlimited audience size. And when you have a very, very short delay, there's practically no delay between the audience and Clubhouse and the stage, and that makes it feel immediate and real, like we're all together. But you are limited in how many people can participate in that low latency experience. So, Frank, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, to that point, in the Twitter room, there are actually affected persons speaking an hour or longer, and a lot of media outlets are really writing news from that. So that is the thing where I think that the politicians get the idea that they can have a dialogue there, or that they will be heard. And a lot of media is covering it. And I know that you like DW, the German Deutsche Welle, and they are constantly in these rooms. So that's just happening live right now.
Great example, actually, because the social audio room. Sorry, John, I'm going to hand it to you next. The social audio rooms. Frank's right. We are now starting to see New York Times, Washington Post, Deutsche Welle, etc. They are now starting to use these rooms, and they're making good show of it. And the natural extension of that is the people who are the movers and shakers behind the headlines will eventually take their step on their seat as the host or on stage. It's inevitable. We saw the same thing happen in Twitter and all social media, how it evolves from grassroots to, the middle of the food chain, and then eventually you got Elon Musk using it, and Biden and the presidents, and it evolves up the sort of hierarchy pyramid as a sort of natural extension. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it looks like we lost Piotr, but for those who haven't been in his room during this crisis, it's amazing. And Paul Davison hangs out in the audience intermittently. And I was hoping that Piotr would be keeping track of his wish list of critical capabilities for Clubhouse, so we could relay that directly to somebody. Is that Piotr?
Yeah, it is. He's on the Twitter.
Yeah, that was Piotr.
Oh, great.
He's
I
on
thought
top
we
of
lost.
it.
Yeah, I thought we lost you. Okay, then I'll stop there. But what you're doing is relatively unique in crisis communication incredibly effectively, and I'm sure there are a lot of capabilities that would make your job easier. Like Aram, I think, was accidentally thrown off the stage and you can't get her back on. Those kind of things they ought to be able to fix so that the room can be more efficiently managed, even though your management to date has been extraordinary. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. I just wanted to actually raise on that point. So, I'm on Twitter now just to give my team the opportunity to just, because otherwise it becomes a sort of a one-man show. So I sort of jump off and just let them engage with it. Anna, also one of our mods who's actually in Ukraine, is sort of there and taking questions. So it has been a marked ability to really meet people. I think one of the most frustrating things about it is the the inability. There needs to be a tiered mod system. I'm talking specifically about Clubhouse. It's something I've wanted from when I first joined in June, because I think that some mods have too much. Like I'm the founder of the club, so I should have like the admin mod badge, and then there should be leaders, and then there should be mods, and then there should be there should be tiered levels, because I had a problem every time I go to bed. There seems to be sort of mutiny or infighting against some members of the team, it's sort of one of them kicks them out. We lost Erin. She was absolutely wonderful, and someone kicked her out, so she can't come back in. So there should be a function where I can override that myself by being able to invite her back in over the the mod who kicked her out. So I do think that there could be refinement in the moderation system. That's one thing. The other thing is, and it's on Twitter as well. I'm concerned by the ability for a few people to have too much influence, and that is including myself. So the guy who's running the room on Twitter for a long time, called oh my god, what's he called? Walter. He is Ukrainian. He lives in New York, and him and I have clashed a few times on this space now, because he is essentially just refusing to draw the distinction between Putin and the people. And as a partial Russian, I think that is a dangerous narrative to be
That's
pushing.
you're actually
And at one
wrong.
point, he just
You're
basically
actually
came across
wrong.
as being Russophobic,
You're
and
you're
basically
actually
made
wrong.
me feel very uncomfortable. And I'm not defending Russia in this, but the point is, we are now
You're
at the point
wrong.
where Russian people
You're
are suffering
you're
Kakao,
literally
filter cannot hear
so I
you, so
think
Kyle later.
there needs to be an awareness of people who are in control of such big spaces, influencing such amount of people. And another issue is, we had a group Twitter account, which we created to alleviate some of the concerns yesterday about this being a self-promotional effort. But the problem was, it's now been suspended. In the past 20 minutes, I just checked, it's suspended, and I don't know why. So there is a lot of sort of, conflicting information going on, and that's, I think, I don't really have an answer to that. I'm just sort of raising it as an example of when you get social audio adding to the flurry of information being spread through tweets and other things, it can mean, information overload, sensory overload, and then people become less and less trusting of the information, and then just sort of disengage altogether. So, it's a delicate balancing act, and this is what I'm seeing from this, marathon I'm running, and being on Twitter as well and stuff. There's a lot. That's all I can say.
Okay, Piotr, hold on a
Similar thing
second.
for Clubhouse.
Yeah, so our friend Cal Patel wanted to challenge you on the point of the labeling of Russians versus Putin,
yeah.
and
I don't I listened to him for 2 hours yesterday. He distinctly separated the two. So just
okay,
take it from there.
Yeah, he's improved. He has improved. We've had
No,
about two
that's not
conferences or video chats,
distinctly. No, he
me and him.
distinctly
So I
understands the
appreciate that.
separation. He
Pointer, give Carol a chance to speak. Thank you.
he
Sorry.
distinctly understood the separation. In fact, there was George Lamour who was on there, was deliberately, as a military strategist. They were really moderating people who were talking about military kind of bravado, etc., and taming them and understanding that, hey, there are people. Both of them were actually saying there are people in Russia. So I just want to make sure that. And this is not like, this is probably not something to discuss, but I just want to. I was there for 2 hours, and I didn't hear, and I heard a complete authentic person that was distinguishing between the two. So he either did a massive transformation since you heard him, or there's just some misunderstanding, or I'm a liar. So we can take it whichever way you want. So I just want to put that out there. Really, I appreciate, Piotr, what you've done on Clubhouse, but I also want to make sure that there are a lot of voices, and on this. On this fund, there are several things you say all at once, and I can say it on this platform because Tyler won't kick me off, because he'll let me finish my statement. There are several things you say, but you don't pause, so it's hard for people to come in and challenge you, right? So there are several things that people may want to challenge you, and so I'd suggest that people do that. They say, in this moment of crisis, you say certain things, and then you pause, and then you say other things, and then you pause. So with that, I'll just pause.
okay. Point number one. Point number two. I have a point to introduce there, which is this Wikipedia article fits very nicely into this back and forth on this issue, which is that Russia's threatening to ban Wikipedia in Russia because of the language on the page dedicated to this. Well, the next word is the essence of the problem, because the Wikipedia page, as the Reuters article says, the Russian authorities have threatened to block Wikipedia over an article that mentions death among Ukrainian citizens as well as Russian forces that have entered Ukraine. Russian Wikipedia said on Tuesday in a tweet. It posted a picture of a notification from the Russian communications regulator informing Wikipedia of a threat from state prosecutors to block the site because of the article. The Wikipedia page is titled Russian Invasion of Ukraine 2022. And Russia takes issue with that. That's not what's happening. We don't want that to be the encyclopedic canonical page that lives forever about what's going on right now. This is the Russian liberation of Ukraine, or no doubt something to that effect. But yet the Wikipedia page, which will live on indefinitely, is titled Russian Invasion of Ukraine 2022. And Russia certainly doesn't like that interpretation of events. And so they're threatening to block Wikipedia in Russia over this page. As you can see, the issue at hand here. And here's what makes this particularly doubly, if not 10 times more interesting, is that this particular page is being edited by Russians. And that's the real kicker. In all of this, it's not that it's Ukrainians making this page. Generally, Wikipedia is trying to be very sensitive to this issue and making sure people's voices are respected of different views. And this is what a great example of the issue of collaborative content creation, where what a really interesting issue. How to do this page justice when you have two totally irreconcilable perspectives about what is actually happening, right? So it's just one for the history books, and in some sense, Wikipedia is the history books, and that's why they're debating so vigorously about it, and why Russia's willing to ban Wikipedia in Russia if they aren't able to sort of have their take reflected in the page. Piotr, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to acknowledge what Carl said before. I mean, the Twitter point, I've been reading that. It's quite an interesting development as well. Yeah, I mean, no, I take your points very much, Carl. I appreciate them. I do talk a lot and talk about lots of different things. So I'm trying my best to sort of address that. I'm very passionate about this because it's got a personal affliction as well, unfortunately. And just on the Twitter Spaces, I guess he's improved it a little bit. That's great to hear. George and I have been running a couple of spaces together, and then I introduced him to that, and he's since become the sort of the go-to military guy, quite rightly. So yeah, I want to try and build. I think the Clubhouse room is going well for sort of large scale general updates and running, but I want to try and. I've got more people on. The thing about Clubhouse is people, since Twitter Spaces was introduced, some of the colleagues I have and people I know, they're sort of like, well, we're happy to hold the Twitter Spaces. We can't really be bothered to sort of sign up to Clubhouse. So that's another thing, is I think improving or adding a bit more flexibility to how you use it or log in, because only a number is, I think, a little bit restricted. Maybe having an additional email or something log in would be useful, because a few people just want to stay. They can't be bothered with the process. So I'm having to hold the occasional Twitter space with a colleague of mine on here just to sort of have a proper expert's opinion on, say, the UN or something like that. So
Piotr?
I think that's another area maybe Clubhouse could improve a little bit, but on the whole, it's going quite well. The back channel is a bit messy, and I think we're testing the servers in the midst of the app. But yeah, thanks again for the constructive feedback.
Go ahead.
Piotr, there's something that's on the rooms that I think Tyler also knows about. It's web listening. So if you go to the bottom